Hello, everyone. Thank you for making it such a great week for the first week of class. The discussions were really good, and so were the blogs, of course. But the reading reviews, I wanted to respond to a few of them because there were some really good insights into the ancient world from you. So I only have about 8 or 9 questions, so it's not going to take very long. I just wanted to respond to some questions that were directed to me and some questions that you came up with that were great. So the first question is, why did some Jews assimilate into the Roman Empire whenever the Romans took over the land of the Jews? Well, some of it is just survival. This is how if you are at the top or near the top of the social ladder, the way that you survive is you got to learn how to get along with the people that are in control. I mean, it's as simple as that. It is amazing to me how people in the Mediterranean area were able to survive, from the Babylonians, to the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. They washed over the whole area like a plague, really, and took everybody's stuff and made people slaves and so on and so forth. But this was the way of the world back then. People conquer, and the conquered assimilate in some ways. Never totally, but there's always a group at the top that assimilates and supports the activity, and there's always some middle ground, and those at the bottom. It doesn't really matter who's in control because their situation is never improved. It doesn't matter if the Romans or Greeks or Jews are in control. The people like Jesus at the bottom are going to be in the same situation they were with the last ruler. So those people tend not to get very patriotic. And we see this kind of activity in World War II. I'm reading a book and studying the way that people in places like France and Poland and other areas that the Nazis conquered, the Nazis set up shop in these countries and conducted war out of them and also demanded their Jews. But there were people at the top of the system that supported them and people at the bottom of the system that supported them. The Nazis became a part of the community, and women had their children, and people traded with them and supported them in sometimes incredibly despicable ways. But you see, in our time, people will support the rulers as they come through, whoever happens to be in charge. Now, why was Rome successful? This is a very important question. For one thing, they had an amazing military. Their military was able to be well fed, well armed, well supported, and they were able to go just about anywhere in the known world within a reasonable amount of time so they could send reinforcements if a battle was going bad. And the second thing that they did that was really brilliant and had never been done before is they set up a government without an administration. Their government was very simple, and it was basically tax collection. The only thing they really wanted from other nations is their stuff. So they decided, why we're not going to colonize, why do that? We're not going to occupy. What we're going to do is administer the country from afar through local leaders, and as long as tribute keeps coming in, we're not going to go back and worry about them. And it worked brilliantly until the Roman army started falling apart. So that's why Rome was so successful. And another thing is they concentrated on assimilation. Their veterans would go and set up shop in conquered nations, and so they were given land and incentive to do so. So that was another aspect of it. But the main thing is the armies and the administration was using local leaders, and they didn't occupy a place. They would instead use local leaders to send tribute to Rome. And Rome was basically like a big giant parasite. It didn't produce anything for itself. It got its bread from Egypt. It had long ago by the time of the first century, it had long ago depleted its own resources for crops, food, and that kind of thing. So they had to take it from people, and they became extremely efficient at it. Okay, languages of Jesus. Now, this is a tricky question. I read Greek all the time. Greek was a lingua franca, the language that we think is most spoken in the ancient world at this time. But the Romans spoke Latin, and the Hebrews spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is a dialect, basically, of Hebrew. If you can read Hebrew and understand Hebrew, you're going to be able to read and understand Aramaic quite easily. So you're not really bilingual if you can speak English and British English. It's the same language. And that's the same thing with Hebrew and Aramaic. They're basically the same language, so you're not really bilingual if you can speak both. So saying Jesus spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, it doesn't really count as two languages when you're comparing it to languages that are actually different, like Greek and Latin. Now, I think that the idea that Jesus spoke Latin as someone of his status, it's crazy. Jesus probably did not speak Latin, but his conquerors certainly did. And so whenever Jesus has the Latin on the sign of the cross, that is for the Roman soldiers and other Latin-speaking people. It's not for the Jews or for Jesus' followers, who were also Jews for the most part. So Jesus probably spoke Aramaic and Hebrew, and he also probably spoke Greek. And the reason why is because the Septuagint at this time was basically the Bible for the Jews. Hebrew was going out of style. Greek was very much in style, so the Jews changed their scriptures in large part from Hebrew to Greek, so the Greek-speaking Jews could read it. So Jesus probably grew up hearing the Old Testament in Greek in the synagogue. Now, we don't know that for sure, but it's possible. And whenever I read Greek all the time. I read the Greek New Testament, and it seems to me like Jesus spoke Greek, but it's because I'm reading in Greek. And it has absolutely nothing to do with what Jesus did. And we know that there are a few sayings I believe it's in Luke and in Matthew, they have Jesus speaking short phrases in Aramaic, and then they translate it into Greek. So it really doesn't matter, but certainly don't think Jesus spoke Latin. So which version of the Bible is considered legitimate? And I answered this question saying, a translation tries to do two things, basically. It tries to translate the word, which means, finding the closest possible English word to the closest possible Greek. And then you make those words sentences and idioms, and you're going to get further and further away from what the word meant originally. So here's another thing. Language, let me use both hands here. Language is not static. At no time are you able to take a single book or a single speech or any other type of language, even a dictionary. The language is changing so fast that dictionaries have to be updated every single year. Now, the essence of words probably don't change very much, but that becomes very significant whenever you try to use a translation to build a theology. To say this is what we believe about God, and there's so many different choices that you can have because language is always changing. Now, here's the really tricky part, is that language in the ancient world is always changing too. At no point in the ancient world is language going to be the same because people are using it differently every single day. So what you have is you have two constantly evolving languages, and you're trying to fit them together as best you can, but it's always moving. It's always changing, going back and forth. Words change, and idioms change, and senses change. The sense of a word. So the process of translation is never going to stop. It's going to be continuing on as long as we can, and the more the merrier. The more translations we have, the more legitimate translations will become. People will say, I don't like the American standard, it's the English standard that's better. And then they say, oh, I don't like the new American standard, it's the English standard that's better, that is closer to the Greek and closer to, in our culture, what it meant in their culture. It's something totally involved and very, very difficult to do. It's not easy. Another thing is, why are manuscripts continually being discovered? The ancient world is still being discovered today. There are places that are mentioned in the New Testament that have not yet been excavated, or they have not yet been excavated completely. I don't think anything has been done, or at least in the past 3 years when I studied Colossae, which the book of Colossians is written to. That book, or that city, has not been excavated at all. Ephesus has, and it's tremendous. But there are hidden libraries, and by hidden I mean you can't see them right now because they're covered in dirt, or they have been demolished, because of time or because of war. We are still going to be discovering large bodies of literature like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library, and we don't even know. The second reason is, whenever these guys like Napoleon and the British Museum and the Louvre, the French, whenever they started excavating independently of each other, of course, the theory was, you're doing a good job excavating if you can dig up a bunch of crap and put it in the museum. They didn't even interpret or catalog or anything. They just sent crates of this stuff home, and crates and crates. And the British Museum has stuff from 200 years ago that hasn't even been touched because there's so much stuff that they received. And they only let the most highly qualified people are allowed to touch it. So it slows down the process considerably. And this is why you're going to have discoveries at the Louvre and at the British Museum from now till infinity, because they have so much junk. So anyway, those are two reasons why manuscripts are still being discovered. Okay, significance of the pig. It's called the abomination of desolation. It's mentioned in Daniel, and it's also mentioned in Revelation. What that is the worst possible thing that could ever happen to the temple. It's not its destruction. The pig is considered the dirtiest, nastiest animal in Judaism. And even today, some Jews don't eat pigs. It's considered the most unclean thing. And the Holy of Holies is the purest thing in ancient Judaism, Second Temple Judaism. And so what happened was, Antiochus Epiphanes told the high priest, whose name was Judas Maccabeus. He was a faithful high priest, faithful to God, and told this high priest, you sacrifice a pig on the Holy of Holies. And Judas went berserk and killed the Roman soldiers who were around him, and then declared a holy war on Rome. And he escaped, went through the mountainside, through the countryside, killing Jews who didn't follow his Judaism, and he raised an army and he fought Rome. Of course, he was unsuccessful, but the point is, the abomination of desolation is the sacrifice of a pig on the highest, holiest altar of Judaism, and it's the worst kind of defamation that can possibly be done in the temple. Okay, the last question is, why is God associated with wine? Wine In Proverbs, it says that wine gladdens the heart of men, and that's why God gave it to us. So most cultures have, including the Greeks and the Romans, they have a god of wine. The god of wine for the Romans at this time was Dionysius, who is um, who has a mystery religion that follows him. And it turns out Dionysius is the god of wine and mirth, and so people had orgies for him or in his name as part of worship. And we went over that in the lecture. But in Christianity and in Judaism, the God of wine is the God of mercy, the just God, the God that we worship. It's a holy thing. Thanksgiving to God for what is good, because wine is considered good. So Jesus turning water into wine is part of that. So that's why God's associated with wine. Okay, I skipped over one thing because I forgot I could not read my handwriting. The mystery religions. People are always excited about the mystery religion and wonder why on earth do we have to study them? Well, one of the most important thing I think that you need to remember is the mysteries. The mystery religions are known as mysteries because they have an initiation process. You can't just walk in and learn what they're teaching, or you can't just walk in and participate in their worship. And for these people, you go through an initiation process in order to learn what's going on. And because of that, the mystery religions were viewed with a certain level of scorn by high well-to-do Romans. They didn't like the idea of the orgies, and they didn't like that their women were going out and doing strange things in the wilderness with the priests and the other guys, and this sex and rock and roll is coming into our town. We're gonna get rid of it. That kind of attitude. Some of it is well founded, but anyway, the mystery religions had to go through an initiation process, which is very easy in the ancient world. And for Christians, the important connection to Christians is Christians had an initiation process. You couldn't just walk into a Christian church after the church has been persecuted. At first, the Christians, they allowed anyone to just walk into a service and take the Lord's Supper and have a good time and learn about Jesus, about the gospel, and all that good stuff. Well, after this period, or shortly after this period, Christians and the people that went to Christian fellowships without actually believing, they were targeted for persecution. They were tortured, and then the bad guys would come in and kill everybody in the church. Find out all the church members or who had been attending church. Now this is happening about 90 CE, about the time that Revelation was written. So how the church responded was they used baptism as an initiation. And you couldn't learn anything about Christianity unless you're baptized. And then it kind of evolved even further, or maybe even at the same time. Early Christian writers say that they would not baptize someone until they had been a member for 3 years, until they'd been a disciple for 3 years. So if that person happened to turn over the Christians to the Romans or to the persecutors, they wouldn't know the church members, and they wouldn't be able to compromise the community. And the thinking is that after 3 years, a person is committed, and they can be baptized, they're part of the community, and when they're tortured, they're not going to give up Christ and the church. So that's why it's so important to know the initiation for these other religions and how it's different from the initiation of Christians. Because later, after the founding of Christianity and all that other good stuff that happened, the Romans started adding things to the mystery religions that are very much like Christianity. The birth narrative of Jesus is very much like the birth narratives of Dionysius and Horus. Now, they also had baptism as initiation. They also had resurrection ideas for their gods. They also had celebrations on the solstice, which is, for us, for Christians, the birth of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. Especially the birth is on the solstice. Sometimes the Easter falls or doesn't fall on the solstice, but whenever you have high holy days in Christianity at the same time as the mystery religions, some people have some problems with that because Christianity is supposed to be unique. And the point I try to make in my lectures and that Metzger makes in the readings is that these connections are very tenuous because they don't happen at the same time. You don't have a Christian coming up with a birth date for Jesus in the New Testament and a Roman coming up with the date 200 years later, and somehow they relate to each other. It's simply not possible. They did have some paths cross. Some Christian may talk to a mystery religion guy, and they decide that something's really cool, and they want to do it at the same time, or the same way. But these mystery religions went in and out of popularity, and it probably did not have much impact on early Christianity, even though there are similarities which happen later. So anyway, you're probably going to see books. There's one book that I ask you to read, actually. It's called The Jesus Mysteries. It is written by a historian and by a biblical scholar. And they think that Jesus is basically Dionysius. And you're going to see that crap on the internet if you do any work on the internet. And you're probably going to see it in print. So now you know. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this class, and I hope you've found this this mini lecture helpful, and I hope to see much more work like this in the future. Thank you.